If you look at how Norman looks, always dressed in a very particular kind of style, it reflects the qualities of his architecture very much. It has that sense of doing things precisely, carefully, consideredly. But you could also say that there's something about his architecture which is hard to read. How do you understand a building which is a black glass, curved screen? You don't quite know what's going on inside. And maybe that's Norman also.
The first drawing I can remember making was of an aircraft, and it used the only knowledge of aircraft that I had firsthand, which was a model aircraft with the high wing, the ribs, and the source of power was, rubber. Strands of rubber. But this was on a Herculean scale. I was up there several stories above the ground with the joystick and the lever that would unleash these, kilometers of rubber that would turn this. And I obviously had this fantasy that, I was sitting there in control of this great craft. I can remember the drawing very well.
You can see all kinds of reasons why Norman, throughout his life, has been so fascinated by flight. There is, of course, the beauty of the artifact, the way that a wing curves over an engine, the way that the rivets bring together pieces of metal. There is also the sense of being in control and command. If he'd been taught to fly when he was in the Royal Air Force, there's no question that the world would have lost an architect. He would have become a pilot.
Ascending a building like the Eiffel Tower changed the way a lot of people saw the world. They literally saw it in another perspective, and that's reflected in the paintings. And I think as an architect, if you're privileged to be able to enjoy that dimension of flight, to be able to see how awesome nature is and the forces of nature, to be able to fly vast distances at high speeds with no engine on solar power, and to be able to literally almost sniff out the rising air from the sinking air and to remain aloft. But it's also about challenges. And it's the poetic dimension. It's something I never tire of, never will.
There is something that is nothing short of awe-inspiring about the idea of a bridge marching forward through a landscape on a series of giant legs the scale of skyscrapers. It even wiggles as you're driving across, so you can see how spectacular it looks. We'd forgotten that useful things could be this beautiful. I remember hearing bombers go over the house
in the middle of the night with my mother. I remember talking rationally about, you know, what kind of bomber it might be, and then just breaking down into a flood of tears, just being absolutely, abjectly terrified.
Norman was an only child. He was born in the mean streets of Manchester just after the Great Depression. Robert, his father, managed a pawnbroker's shop. His mother, Lily, became a waitress.
My voice had changed when my father died. My father was a tenor, and somehow, you know, there was some gift in passing, and I just found a new voice almost. And I was asking him about his father and what he got from his father. And Norman said, well, both from his father and his mother, just work ethic. They worked and they worked and they worked. And then he said the only thing was that he, perhaps as a result of them working so hard, he hadn't got to know them as well as he would have liked.
One of the things that he did for the portfolio to get to university was to draw the view from his bedroom window. The view he had was of a railway line which went right past his window at eye level, and he would have been out there looking at these big black steam engines, rushing past, throwing out smoke and cinders. Under the track, there's a passageway that goes from Norman Street, which is humble and poor. You can smell the damp. But you go through this tunnel under the railway, and you find yourself suddenly in a middle-class suburb with trees on the streets and detached villas. And you realize, of course, that Norman was on the wrong side of the tracks. The essence of Norman's architecture is that design can make things work better. And it's a very optimistic belief. Architecture can make your life feel better. On a small scale, it transformed his adolescent bedroom in the suburbs of Manchester. Later, it could take him away from that narrow world and make almost anything possible.
Architecture, I guess, for me is something that moves the spirit, that really works in terms of all the senses. In that sense, it's about the things that you can measure, that you can quantify, and if you like, the spiritual dimension, which is rooted in all of the senses and which you can't measure, but you know it's there, it moves you, it moves your spirits. This was the School of Architecture. Unbelievably. The same ceiling, the extraordinary staircase. Difficult to imagine it. But very familiar.
Yale in 1961 was still under the spell of modernism. Paul Rudolph, the dean, had been a student of Walter Gropius, founder of the Bauhaus, and the fire of the modern movement was still alive. Yale was full of strong teachers, but it was dominated by Rudolph. He was the man who taught Foster how to draw like an architect, and even how to look like one.
Having been inspired initially by American architects, Foster has then returned later in his career to remind Americans of lessons that they gave the world originally, but then subsequently forgot. So he's, like many people of his generation, someone who admired America perhaps more than it deserved at a time, and is kind of more enthusiastic about America than the Americans are themselves, because America isn't quite what Foster imagined it to be. He had a romantic vision of America.
Just going back, it's Manhattan, it's New York, it's the skyline, it's the city of towers. You think of skyscrapers, it's New York. The good news is that we have a tower in New York. The bad news is that it's a very, very small tower amongst the most extraordinary collection of mega towers. And how do you make this tower have a presence when it's physically so small?
Scale, in a way, is not the same thing as size. Scale is a quantity of somewhat abstract proportions. It bears a relationship at one level to the body, but it bears a bigger relationship to the imagination. The way, if you like, the pyramids in Egypt do. They remain, whatever you do, you walk up them, you walk around them, they remain the scale they are, which is somehow bigger than what they really are.
When the Hearst building was finished, I called Foster the Mozart of modernism, because I thought that conveyed the way his work seems sort of lyrical, elegant, and effortless. And just as we know with Mozart, there was huge effort behind all that, but part of his genius was to produce this finished piece of music that didn't show the effort. It just seemed to sort of dance perfectly through the air. Well, Foster buildings tend to do that. They don't show their effort.
That diagrid, triangulation, not only produces something which is inherently stronger, and we can go back in terms of antecedents to Buckminster Fuller, Barnes Wallis, and those aircraft of the late 30s, structures in nature which are triangulated, inherently stronger, using 20% less steel. A good start in terms of the sustainability story, especially when 80% of that is recycled steel.
The Hearst Tower set out to be as green as possible, but magically it also manages to come up with a new geometry that no New York skyscraper had ever tried before. The corners look as if they dissolve into thin air.
I like the building in New York, and I told him that, and he said it was too squat. And I said, no, that's wrong. I think the muscularity of that building I like. I think that's a very good building.
The trouble with so much sculpture is the larger it gets, the worse it gets. And I think the architects understand how when something is put outside in the open air, it changes. The air eats into it, and it has to be richer, and it has to be altogether different. And I think all these things, we haven't even got to first base on, and architects know all about it. So we can learn from them on this.
I'm fascinated by the work of artists and the relationship between space and works of art, the synergy between, a painting, a sculpture, a furniture, the way that those those come together, which is a kind of endless personal pursuit.
Norman would have stayed in America. He was happy there. He felt at home there. He had a job in San Francisco. But he kept in touch with Richard Rogers, and the idea of forming a practice in London came up. When Richard got a project, Norman joined him. He could always go back if it didn't work. So Norman got back on the plane and flew back to Europe to discover that Team 4 wasn't exactly this big professional office.
It was actually in Norman and Wendy's flat. It was in a house, you know, in Hampstead Hill Gardens. I'll never forget it. And they used to have to reorganize the flat every morning to turn it from a flat into an office. And of course, if they were having a client to see them, you know, they had to do all sorts of things, you know. I remember they had this enormous great white wooden box that covered the bed. And they used to put models on the box, you know, so it looked like a sort of display unit. It really was a scream.
Team 4 was where Foster met his first wife, Wendy. They worked with Richard Rogers and his first wife, Sue, and also Georgie Walton, Wendy's sister. It was a short-lived partnership that lasted only 3 years. Their first big job was the Reliance Controls factory just outside Swindon, which was the first British high-tech building.
And Reliance Controls was the first really successful building in terms of it won the Financial Times Award, and we thought, we've made it. Any inquiry we got was somebody wanted to know how to clean the floor in the factory. So it didn't really make it.
It was an extraordinary time. It was almost like a pop group in a way, where all the things that brought these individuals together eventually had the seeds of the things that would provoke them to go in their own directions a relatively short period afterwards.
Team 4 split up, and it was time for a new start. Norman and Wendy decided to stay in London, and together they formed Foster Associates.
If I think back to 1967, then really Foster and Partners was formed, or rather, it was at that time 2 people, my late wife Wendy and I, who formed Foster Associates. There are only 2 problems. First of all, we had no work, and there were no associates.
The Willis Faber office building in Ipswich looked a lot like a giant black glass grand piano. Foster took a radical approach to everything about it: how it looked, how it worked, the techniques used to build it, the comforts it offered its users, its reduced energy use.
How do you give glamour to an office building? And in Willis Faber, we sought to create a lifestyle. So it had a swimming pool in a town which at that time didn't have a public swimming pool. It had an atrium, it had plants, and part of that was the color and the shiny ceiling, which was a response in a way from some lessons that I learned on the Olsen building. I remember the first time walking up the stairway and seeing this green ceiling and thinking, my God, what happened? I thought it was a white ceiling. And of course, it was a white ceiling, but it was just sucking the colors. So this ceiling was very subtle, extraordinary.
I remember the first time ever looking back in the wake of my ship and seeing all the whiteness and the foam. I said, that's white because it all consists of bubbles. I said, how many bubbles am I looking at? And I was fine, I'm looking at fantastic numbers of bubbles. It comes in this way. Look at all this whiteness, all those bubbles. Beautiful, beautiful bubbles, every one of them. I said, now, I've been taught at school, in order to be able to design, because a bubble is a sphere, you have to use pi.
Buckminster Fuller was the last of the American eccentric geniuses, a messianic, even slightly odd figure who roamed the world in his bow tie, giving speeches to students that inevitably went on for at least 5 hours. Foster jumped at the chance to work with Fuller, and the two began a conversation that never stopped until the day that Fuller died. Fuller's big idea was to do more with less, to make the strongest structures using the least amount of resources. He was an engineer, an architect, an ecologist who defied any label. In 1951, he coined the phrase spaceship Earth, the very image of humanity floating on a fragile vessel lost in the middle of space.
I remember flying him in a helicopter to the Sainsbury Centre at the University of East Anglia. And then we spent really quite a long time walking around the building, going back into the building, through the spaces, talking about it. And when he came back into the restaurant, he drew attention to the way that the sun had moved, the shadows had changed, and then he turned around to me and said, "How much does your building weigh, Norman?" And of course, I didn't know the answer.
How much does your building weigh? And even Norman was stunned into silence. But being Norman, a week later, he had the answer. 5,328 tons, most of which was lost in the invisible concrete substructure.
In the course of finding out how much the building weighed, of course, I realized the disproportionate amount of weight in the least attractive part of the building. It was an interesting voyage of discovery. So in a way, Bucky was always provoking himself, challenging himself, and challenging everybody around him.
Some people would see Fuller as an impossible dreamer, with wild ideas about covering Manhattan with a dome. On one level, Norman seems so different. He's an architect who seems to be the personification of the organized and the ordered. And yet it's clear that Fuller made a real mark on Norman. And I think the difference is that when Norman talks about covering a city with a dome, you believe he could do it. The Sainsbury Centre was a vision from another planet, a stunning, optimistic view of what architecture could be. It was like an elegant and refined machine that had the classical precision of a Greek temple sitting in a green landscape. Finished in 1978, Robert Sainsbury called the centre the finest thing in his collection. If you could put the Sainsbury Centre next to HSBC, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong, you would see the difference between a glider and a jumbo jet. They're both about forms of flight, about new ways of dealing with materials. The massive exposed structure, the diagonal braces, the bridge structure of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank makes it a weighty building, one which is soaring towards the sky. It's powerful, it's dynamic, where the Sainsbury Centre is calm and floating. It was the first time that anybody outside America made a skyscraper that looked like it wasn't just a copy of an American original. Norman went back to first principles, deconstructed the skyscraper, and made his own rules. He put the structure on the outside, a move that created some remarkable spaces. It was beautifully built, and it was a landmark that became internationally recognized, a symbol for the bank and its commitment to Hong Kong, before the handover to China.
We'd never done a tall building before, so we were hungry for the opportunity. But we also borrowed up to the hilt, and we were taking massive risks. And I suppose in a way, you're always taking risks. Then we were gambling, if you like, with the bank, in the sense that if we had not won that competition, we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now. We'd have gone bankrupt.
Norman had come a long way by the time that he finished the bank. He'd transformed his life. He'd become a very successful, very visible architect. He had built an astonishing project in Hong Kong, which the world came to see. It was called the most expensive building the world had ever seen. He looked as if he was at the top of his game. But just when things seemed to be going so well, some bad things began to happen. The financial position of the practice was seriously weakened with the end of the monthly fee coming in from Hong Kong to pay the overheads. There was a series of Black Fridays. He had to let people go, and he began to worry even about being able to survive. At about the same time, Wendy, who'd been so important to make the practice work, became sick. She had cancer. She died.
It was a terrible time. What can seem absolutely tragic and devastating at the time, it still obviously has a tragic dimension if many years later you look back on it. But on the other hand, life has moved on. We've all moved on. And you have a better measure of satisfaction, of friendship, of love, of whatever. Many times, I think I need the silence. And it's not an escape. It's a kind of complementary activity. At times, it's so completely absorbing, but there are other times when you're cross-country skiing, when you're cycling, you can reflect, and often I find solutions to designs. There are many dimensions to those pursuits. Obviously they're about pleasure, but they're so inextricably linked with what I do as a designer.
Foster has become placeless to quite an extraordinary extent. Brushes with bankruptcy have overshadowed many architects' careers. So once Foster had the chance to work outside Britain, he saw building a global practice as the key to survival. Downturns on one continent can be compensated for by booms on another. The experience of working on a worldwide scale has transformed Foster and his work. You can see now that there's a certain level of impatience with the way the old Europe does things. He wants to bring home what he's learned.
The approach is always to go there and to experience it and to live it and to, if it's people, you live with the people, you know, you take your own human camera, as it were, and there's no substitute for that. You know, Norman's always taught us that you must do it, which is one of the reasons why he's always the first one, you know, on the site.
It's not a building, and it's not the physicality of a studio. It's the philosophy, the way in which, beyond my lifespan, that will move on and have its own life. That, I think, is the most difficult design of all, and the one I'm most proud of. As a team, we've reinvented the genre, we've reinvented the airport, we've reinvented the nature of a high-rise building, reinvented the relationship of the old and new in terms of, you know, how you create a new life cycle for a historic building, keeping the best of its identity from the past. And perhaps all of us, in one way or another, reinvent ourselves in terms of changing circumstances, or from experience or knowledge, or feeding off new challenges.
Architecture is also about power. It creates the landmarks that cultures of very different kinds have used throughout history to express who and what they are.
Whether it's, you know, the Golden Gate or whether it's Sydney Harbour, the bridge becomes the symbol of the place, transcends the original function. And in that sense, I think that the way in which the Reichstag, for example, which was very much about creating the democratic forum for a reunified Germany, has become not only the symbol of the city, but it's become the symbol of the nation.
The capture of the Reichstag at the end of World War II was the defining image of Hitler's defeat. Its reconstruction by a British architect was an equally powerful symbol of the reunification of a very different democratic Germany. The question for Foster is, do you restore the damage? Do you take what's left of the old building and make it look new again? Or do you show what's happened to that building? Do you show its history? Do you keep the Russian soldiers' sometimes obscene messages written on the stone? In Foster's view, of course you do. This is part of German history. You can't just wipe these things out.
Yeah? Yeah, but we need, is this really hot water?
Is it actually very, very hot? Does this go so hot?
Let's see.
Because I let it like 3 minutes
Really?
going.
You think it's pretty hot?
Yeah, because I let it 3 minutes going to
Right.
take the glass,
Okay, can you put it into here?
the water,
Yeah.
all.
Mm.
For what is this?
To fill the boiler.
To put this out?
It's full. I think we can say categorically it's more than full.
Do you put this one down?
No, we need to put some fuel in there.
And what for?
It says the maximum 3 pieces. Starting to smell. Hope it doesn't explode in our face.
Why does it, how can it explode?
A little bit of experimentation is needed here. It's getting hot. You can start to smell
Can you-
it.
I think the oil.
Hey. Hey.
What was that?
Okay, let's go.
Yay! Mommy!
Let it build up some steam. Because if we do the...
Can you take it?
It's fantastic. Look at that.
Ever since he was a child, Norman's been fascinated by models. He makes them, he collects them. In his house, he has shelf after shelf of exquisitely crafted model aircraft and cars. And even as architecture becomes a more and more digital design process, models are a key part of his practice. For Norman, it's not simply about seeing how a building will look. It's a means of understanding what a full architectural experience will be.
I believe that the infrastructure of spaces, connections, the public domain, the kind of urban glue that binds the buildings together is more important than any one building. Also, perhaps, trying to reinvent concepts like an airport in such a way that the experience of the airport be uplifting, where really an airport has got to the point in terms of crowds and security and so on, that it's, a kind of reviled building type.
The airport is the modern city gate, a symbolic national front door reflecting the aspirations of a culture. But negotiating the terminal is a stressful, anxious experience for most passengers. A good airport is easy to understand. One that allows you to move through it without having to ask for directions or look for signs. It celebrates travel rather than makes the journey an ordeal. If you can see an aircraft, the runway, and the sky beyond, you have a natural orientation. China wanted a building that would make a strong statement about their country's new place in the world. It's the largest building on the planet. Its architectural language is both contemporary and rooted in Chinese culture.
The geometry of the roof is like an analogy of a kind of crouching lion dragon It's very modest looking, but once you get inside, it's completely overwhelming, completely the opposite of the space that you would imagine.
Building Beijing's new airport in just 4 years was an astonishing achievement, only made possible by a highly organized 50,000-strong workforce. They lived on the site, working 3 non-stop shifts round the clock. At one point, there were 100 tower cranes on the site.
I remember doing the competitions for the Terminal 5 at Heathrow, and we didn't win. A year and a half later, we did the competition for Cheplak Kok in Hong Kong. We won that competition. I went out, we built the buildings. The building operated for 7 years before Terminal 5 at Heathrow opened. So that's how long things take in UK. We now have a tremendous amount to learn from the best of those emerging economies and the way in which they are thinking big, thinking strategically, taking bold initiatives. The examples are, in a way, almost so obvious. You just wonder why it takes so long for the penny to drop.
Masdar City in Abu Dhabi is an attempt to show how that might be done. In the 50-degree desert heat, it's a hugely ambitious plan for a carbon-neutral city of 100,000 people. Movement in the city will rely on a network of driverless electric vehicles, guided by invisible sensors, running across the city at ground level, while pedestrians walk on a deck above.
If vehicles are going to become more efficient and driverless, and they're going to follow networks and they're going to be programmable, then you have to separate them from the human, because the human's unpredictable. And that's why the city's lifted, and that's going to be revolutionary for transportation.
To put $15 billion into focusing on a centre for renewable technologies and to spend oil money, which is there now, on it, you know, with the foresight, thinking 20, 30 years down the line, is unbelievable. Why aren't we doing that?
Will Masdar be the first carbon-neutral city in the world? We don't know yet. If it works, it's a huge achievement. If it fails, it's a heroic failure.
If we achieve a zero waste, zero carbon, then that will be a kind of miracle. The tragedy is that given the urgency of the situation, given what is at stake, which is literally our survival as a species, the thing that I find inexplicable is that there is only one Masdar. You know, if there were 20 urban experiments in terms of 20 cities happening around the planet now, one would be very, very critical and say, why only 20? Yeah. That is the shocking thing. That is unbelievable. The big issues in terms of coupling all this together can only be a political initiative. And I think that probably it'll have to get almost to the point of absolute desperation before everybody is forced to get their act together. And then the agonizing question will be, did everybody wake up in time, or did they wake up too late?
What on earth is a man in his 70s doing pushing himself to the extremes of the cross-country marathon? It's painful to do it. Once he was wearing the wrong kind of gloves and he got frostbite. It took him 6 months to recover, but he did it again the year after, and the year after that. It hurts. It's also a very isolated thing to do. Yes, you're surrounded by all the other people in the marathon, but you're alone in the physical determination. You have to finish.
I suppose that I've, until relatively recently, been immune from illness, so the idea of a hospital or drugs or an operation was a kind of alien concept. 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. That was pretty horrific. That was probably the worst moment of my life, one of the worst. I remember struggling through the idea, struggling through the 48 hours before I was kind of rushed to hospital. I remember being told at the time that I was fortunate because it could have been a heart attack. Little was I to know that 2 years later I'd have a heart attack. And the thing perhaps that really was important to me was the idea that at the end of that 6 months, I would still be able to train for the cross-country ski marathon. And I was told by the doctor that, forget it, you'll never do it in 6 months, you'll have relapses, it'll take longer. The reality was that I did it to the day in 6 months. So I think that in some ways, a state of denial is perhaps at times helpful.
Like so many other challenges, Norman came through that health crisis. The constant thing about Norman is that he will not stop. He will not let himself get beaten down by things. He will always pick himself up. He will always start again. And there's always another turn in the Foster story.
Everything is a fresh start. I mean, I'd love to do every project that I've ever looked at and have a second bite at it, because you can always go one step further. And if you can't go one step further, then it means that you haven't learned from what you've done before, and you're not sharp. Then it's time to say stop and do something else.